Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We set up the Transparency Task Force in 2015 as a result of a career's worth of frustrations at the opacity in the financial industry. I genuinely believe the financial sector is profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and through economic stability to political stability as well. But despite its importance, in my personal experience, what I've seen is that the financial sector has a predisposition to be opaque when it should be transparent, to be self-serving when it should be serving society. And quite frankly, if you were to ask me what are the main learnings that I've had since 2015, it would be this: that the entire hierarchy of oversight and governance of the world's financial ecosystem is poor at doing its job. That's why there is so much going wrong around the world from a financial perspective. And of course, problems in the financial ecosystem bleed their way into politics, into society, into standards of living, into lack of security in old age, and all the other big ticket issues that people like us are genuinely increasingly concerned about. At the heart of all this is the money system itself. We've run a few events about the money system, and we've had the pleasure, the real pleasure, of Professor Steve Keen speaking at most of those. And quite frankly, if we don't have a decent understanding of the money system, there'll never be effective policy making and stewardship. And quite probably the single biggest challenge we have is the amount of misunderstanding caused by misinformation. Arguably, much if not all of that misinformation is not accidental, it's deliberate. It's an attempt, I would argue, to put a slant on things, to deceive the way the financial system works. And at the very, very heart of that question is the question, where does money actually come from? And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Not only where does it come from, but also where is it going? I would suggest, folks, that it is pretty much impossible for any sensible stewardship orientated policy making to be done well if there is a profound misunderstanding of the workings of the money system and the economy. And if you don't already, I predict that by the end of today's session, you're going to be scratching your heads wondering how on earth is there such a disconnect between the reality of the economic and monetary system with the perception that most people have of it. And how did we get here? It's going to be a really, really fascinating conversation. Before we hear from Professor Steve Keen, a gentleman who I hold in the highest regard, not just because of what he knows, but perhaps even more importantly, because his willingness to stand up and speak out, to challenge the orthodoxy, to say, no, that actually doesn't make sense. It doesn't work like that. I reckon Professor Steve Keen's worldview must be dominated by the thought that he's often surrounded by economists who are effectively people who would argue that the earth is actually flat.
I call them Tolnake.
There we go. All the evidence is pointing to a different reality to the reality that they walk around with. And that's not meant to be disrespectful to those economists. They probably think the way that they think because of the way that they've been spoon-fed, the education, inverted commas, that they've had over many, many decades. And once they've embraced a particular paradigm, they become really defensive of it. It would be so anxiety laden for them to let go of some things they hold to be true that actually are false. But tonight's conversation is actually something we owe a debt of gratitude to Charlie Boyle for. Charlie's our first speaker. Charlie and I were having a lovely conversation, it must have been about 2 months ago, when Charlie was basically explaining to me that he's genuinely concerned that there's a lack of dialogue around this very, very important matter. And the conversation went to, well, why don't we get these thoughts out in the open? So in a moment, I'm just going to be inviting Charlie to share his thoughts. We'll then be going to Steve. We'll make this as interactive as possible. Please think of this as your event. The Transparency Task Force is a highly, highly inclusive community. We don't, hold ourselves out on any kind of formality or any kind of protocols. Just speak honestly, speak your mind, do it in a civilized and constructive way, but don't hold back. If you can't find yourself feeling comfortable sharing what you really think here, you'll probably not find yourself feeling comfortable saying what you really think anywhere. So you're amongst friends. Please feel free to express yourselves accordingly. So before we do anything else, can I please invite everybody to put their hands together and say thank you to Charlie, and we'll pass the mic, so to speak, over to Charlie to get the ball rolling for us, and then we'll be passing over to Professor Steve Keen. So Charlie Ball, thank you very much indeed, sir. Please, let's show our appreciation. Charlie, please take a moment to introduce yourself, because you've got a really interesting background and perspective on all these things. And over to you, sir. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate the opportunity as well. So, yeah, just very briefly, I'm an accountant. I trained as an accountant before the 2008 crisis. I went a bit sideways since then. I worked as a trader for a short time and then inter-dealer broker, although I didn't really enjoy it. I moved to Cyprus and got caught in the second banking crisis, where I actually had money in that bank as well. And at that point, I really started to wonder about what on earth was going on in the financial system across the world. And I obviously spent a lot of time out of work for various reasons, and I started trying to piece together what the problems were, mainly to just sort of keep myself sane, really, and try and sort of comfort myself in the fact that it wasn't my fault, or that there were reasons for it, and it was only a matter of time before I got out of it. I also found it very difficult to raise awareness among the media, and I sort of became known as a whistleblower because I blew the whistle on Barclays back in 2014, and I thought there's got to be a more interesting way of getting into these topics without coming across as some sort of rabid dog troublemaker. So I got into finance consultancy. I'm very well paid as a cash consultant. I've worked for Disney, French Connection, all sorts of other big names, big banks as well. But what I do on the side now is I'm an independent journalist. I've gone on live TV across the world, RT amongst others. Had a very short relationship with the BBC before I got totally disillusioned with them, which is after about 3 days, I think. So I have two hats on at the moment. I go in and I sort out big companies' problems, and then my separate hat is doing the journalism thing, and more broad, not just finance, but I did a lot of interviews on COVID. That was where the BBC came in, and more generally on politics and how it all fits together and why we're in such a mess, and the conflicts of interest amongst politicians, the media, business, Rupert Murdoch, and how that feeds from finance and the accounting institutes and the regulators and all that one big close club. And so I'm really about raising awareness of that. That's my background. I'll just carry on, Andy. Okay, so I knew Paul Moore before he died, and we were part of a foundation that was trying to reform the banking system. It wasn't very successful for a number of reasons, most of which were out of our control. Having said that, we didn't really do ourselves any favors, and maybe we didn't approach it the right way. We were very naive about the media, I have to say, and how difficult it would be to get the word out. We thought if the story was good enough, it would always get out, and it didn't necessarily. One of the things that I got involved in very early on was Positive Money, and they gave everyone that wanted to know a very good overview of how money is created in the modern world, which is completely different to how it's seen by most people and the media. So if you, I sort of put through a few very brief bullet points on this. I didn't want to do slides because I think a lot of people turn off when you see slides, especially numbers, but in terms of money in today's world, my understanding, and this is why I'm really happy that Steve's here, a big fan of his work. I wanted him to talk about the technical aspect of this, because it's very difficult to find any information on this and piece everything together. So my understanding is, in the modern world, you have money printing by the central bank, but the vast majority of the money that comes into circulation in today's Western economies is through high street banks. So in other words, you go into a bank, you say that you want a loan for a mortgage or whatever it might be, and then at that point in time, the money's digitally created from nothing, and then the accounting starts at that point in time. In other words, the money doesn't exist. My understanding is, from a high street bank perspective, the money is created at that point in time when the loan's created. The accounting then debits the bank's balance sheet as an asset and then creates some sort of loan account with the Bank of England. Then when the money's paid back, the money disappears from the system, and then the interest is pocketed by that bank. So it's my understanding that most of the money printing that happens now is effectively done by the mainstream banks and not by the government. So this is where I really started thinking about, especially what happened during COVID. There was a lot of talk about the Bank of England creating billions and billions of pounds to buy government bonds, and that's what's fueling inflation now. Now, of course, there are various different arguments as to what actually caused inflation since COVID. The Ukraine war is obviously a factor, but it seems to me that most of the actual inflation in terms of asset prices is surely not fueled by unlimited credit creation by these high street banks, and no one seems to be talking about it. Every time there's even a headline about inflation, all we hear is war in Ukraine, Brexit, and Bank of England money printing. I think we should be having a conversation about what the process is about money creation, origination of loans in these banks, why it's not being talked about, why there's so much ignorance about it, because it seems to me as a journalist, there's a big difference between misinformation and disinformation. I think that the vast majority of what's being talked about in the mainstream, including good channels like Channel 4 News, is misinformation because they don't understand the basics of how money is created in the modern day. So if you go back in time, it used to be, so the classic thinking was someone went into a bank, they got a load of money, cash, whatever it is, they put it in a vault, even though it's not really a custodian, and then they'd lend a certain amount of it out to somebody else, and then they'd hold a certain amount back, which is part of the fractional reserve system. It seems to me that we've got to a point, at some point in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, where we've had the possibility of digital money, and at the same time, they've sneaked in with the fact that these high street banks can basically create money themselves. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's wrong, because personally, if a bank's creating money for a justifiable, productive reason, like a mortgage, for example, maybe that's preferable to a central bank just creating it for whatever the government wants to waste it on that day. But I think we should definitely have a conversation about how much is being created, how much of it could be due to mainstream inflation. And by the way, inflation isn't 7 or 10%, it's 7 or 10% on average, right? There's a lot of people that pay a lot more than that. There are a lot of people that are already wealthy that pay close to zero. And of course, on the back of that, what's the limit on the banks in terms of losses? So what's stopping them from basically creating unlimited amounts of credit for mortgages and nothing else? Well, it seems to me that the only real limit is the amount of risk they take. And then, of course, if the loan goes bad, all of a sudden they have to absorb all their capital by taking a huge loss. Whereas if the loan gets paid back, the money disappears back into the abyss as though it's never been created. And then the bank just sort of pockets the interest. So that's also part of the conversation as well. And, I'm not saying I'm right on all of this. This is what I've just tried to piece together from everything that I've sort of researched and seen on the media. But it's damn hard work even getting to this point. And I think at least we should have a conversation. That's pretty much what I said to Andy a few weeks ago. I don't necessarily have an opinion either way. I'm certainly not any sort of technical expert. I'm more on the accounting side, but I do think people need to start talking about it, because if inflation keeps going like it is, there's a question mark about what's actually really driving it and to what extent.
Charlie, thank you so much. Thank you. I personally, how can I put this? I've personally witnessed the consequences of poor economic policy. As a dad, one of the things you really want to do is help your kids get on the property ladder, especially in the UK. My eldest son was within days of completing on the purchase of his first home. And to cut a long story short, that coincided with the Truss government, and we all know what happened there. The net result is that the deal he was going to get all fell through. The people up the chain fell through. It all went horribly, horribly wrong, and it's sort of setting back years because of the rather volatile nature of interest rates at around that time. So I'm making the point purely because we are not talking about things that are only relevant in the abstract. They are real things having a real effect on real people like us. So the very least we should do is make sure we understand the system. And if, like myself, you're becoming more and more cynical about the way mainstream media, mainstream politics, mainstream economics pumps out a particular convenient narrative, if you become more and more skeptical of that, you start finding yourself asking questions. And in my experience, when you start asking those questions, you find yourself with more and more questions that need to be asked. Charlie, thank you very much indeed for getting the ball rolling in our conversation today.
Andy, can I just add one very quick point on the back of what you just said?
Please do.
I think it's important to bear in mind that even if interest rates stayed at the level and we didn't have the Truss nightmare, if you've got this unlimited credit creation by banks that's fueling underlying inflation, we're not talking about it, then even if you're paying low interest rates as a first-time buyer, if the house is 50% more expensive in the first place because there's more demand, because banks are just doling out mortgages like water, then that's going to have an effect as well.
Well, thank you, Charlie. I remember coming away from one of the conversations we had with Steve before, one of our previous meetings, with this kind of impression that the world's economy is being stuffed with credit, just stuffed with credit. It made me think about foie gras ducks. They ram food down these ducks to make them produce great big livers. They do that in a particular part of France. I can't remember where, but I started to kind of imagine the world's financial ecosystem being rather large, like one of these ducks that is being force-fed beyond its natural kind of capacity. Really powerful imagery came to my mind. Charlie, thank you very much indeed for getting the ball rolling for us. Folks, can we do two things? Can we thank Charlie for his opening remarks? As we do so, can we welcome Professor Steve Keen? Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Professor Steve Keen. Steve, over to you. And of course, you're very welcome to share slides as you wish. Thank you.
I know quite a few of the names of people here, so I'm going to be actually doing more lobbying for using Minsky amongst this group, because I think the more the point that Charlie made just then is that the knowledge of how it works is something which most people don't have. So what I've done with my building of Minsky software is enable that to be something anybody can understand if they download Minsky and install it and play with it. That's why I put a link in there, and I'm going to be hitting it fairly heavily in this talk as well. But the starting point is, and Charlie alluded to this, and so has Andy, if you've learnt neoclassical economics, which is what you get taught at a university, everything you've been taught about money is wrong. Okay, you might know something differently, that's good. Any way you disagree with what you were taught is a way you know more than the people who taught you. And I really thought in 2014 that all my Christmases came at once when this paper came out from the Bank of England, saying specifically that the reality of how money is created differs from the description in some. Some is code word, it actually means all economics textbooks. Okay? There are a couple of exceptions done by the modern monetary theory crowd or non-orthodox economists, but any textbook you're going to get at any mainstream university is going to teach you stuff which is just nonsense. So the Bundesbank even topped it in 2017 and came out with a very more detailed paper actually than the Bank of England, and saying, if you look at how money and credit are created, it's interaction between banks, non-banks, and the central banks, and there's no role for excess reserves or deposits. Now, if you go to a mainstream university like Harvard, where I was last week, Greg Mankiw will teach you that's wrong, and he's wrong. If you go to the one in London, same story, you'll be taught nonsense. So let's just look at the things about which the mainstream is wrong. If you divide the neoclassical versus the real world and look at the private sector, they'll tell you banks are intermediaries, they're money creators. They'll tell you reserves are essential to lend, they're irrelevant. They'll tell you debt doesn't matter, it's crucial. They'll tell you money doesn't matter in economics, the economy is fundamentally monetary. They'll tell you credit has no role in macroeconomics, it's actually the most volatile component, and provably so. The government is always seen as disturbing the market system, when in fact the government fundamentally creates the market system by creating money. It's seen as owing debt to the private sector, when in fact it creates that debt for the benefit of the private sector. A deficit as being undesirable in the long run. In other words, it's essential. And they think a surplus is a good idea during booms. And when I take a look at the data, surpluses during booms have actually caused speculative bubbles, which then burst, such as little things like the Great Depression and the Great Recession. So what you need to do is learn the basic point which Charlie is making early on, and I'm glad you've done the accounting because you'll find this quite straightforward, is money is created by accounting operations. And you start on what's known as the fundamental equation of double entry bookkeeping, virtually the fundamental equation of accounting, that assets minus liabilities equals your equity, or assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. Now, that's normally thought about just in terms of an individual financial position. But when you apply this to a macroeconomy, and you're just looking just at financial assets here, and a financial asset is a claim on someone else. Okay? Now, therefore, if you add up all claims on somebody else, the sum is zero. Okay? That's, in a sense, a conservation law. Your asset is somebody, your financial asset is somebody else's financial liability. You add the two together, you get zero. Therefore, you do the point therefore becomes a macroeconomic point, that if one group, if one person, one entity, one sector of the economy is in positive equity with respect to the rest of the economy, then the rest is an identical negative equity. That's a conservation law. It's absolutely true. It doesn't apply to financial assets. I'll talk about non-financial assets. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it does apply to financial claims. Now, banks are a particular form of institution in a capitalist economy, and they must not be in negative equity, negative short-term equity. So if you therefore imagine a world where there's simply private money creation and no government money creation, and that's pretty much imagining the 19th century in America. Okay, it's not as far-fetched as it might sound, because we're used to the government being 30% of GDP, 30 to 50% in most Western economies. But you look back in the 19th century, in America, it was 5 to 10% of GDP, often lower. So if you have a situation like that, where the banks are the only ones creating money, and the banks have to be in negative equity, then without a government, the private non-bank sector has, so the banks must not be in negative, they've got to be positive. Therefore, the non-bank private sector must be in negative equity. Now, when you're in negative equity, your behavior tends to be a bit weird. Oh, my debts are more than my assets. I might see if I can borrow some money from a bank and gamble on rising house prices and make myself wealthier that way. I think a lot of our crazy behavior comes out of this fact that we're in negative equity and we can't cope. Now, when you bring in the government as well and say, well, the government can also in positive or negative equity, can it cope with negative financial equity? Well, the basic answer, yes, because A, it's a money creator, but B, the government effectively owns the country. The non-financial assets it backs its financial position with are overwhelming in the area where its money rules the roost. So the government can handle being in negative equity. If the government's in negative equity, that enables the rest of the world, non-government, to be in positive equity. And it could even mean that when you have both a banking sector with private money creation being in positive equity, the private non-bank sector can also be in positive equity if the government's in sufficiently negative equity. So this is all about financial. I'm just making a little warning there that I'm not talking about non-financial assets, though we can model them in my software, and I will talk about them if we want to discuss it later. So you then have, in a capitalist economy, you have two forms of money, two ways in which money can be created. Governments can create money by running a deficit, spending more than they take back in taxation. The private banking sector can create money by lending out more than it gets back in repayments. And they're both endogenous. Now, there's been a long debate in economics of what they call endogenous versus exogenous money. The conventional theory says the government is 100% in control of the money supply. It sets the amount of money, moving a vertical supply of money. If any of you have suffered through a course in macroeconomics, that's the vertical part of the LM curve, the liquidity money model that's supposed to give you the market interest rate. The idea is the government has a strict external control of the amount of money. It can vary the amount of money at will, and therefore it determines the supply. The demand is determined by interest rates. That's part of the conventional model. There is no such thing as exogenous money. The way I look at money instead is endogenous, saying, can a system created with no other external input? And the answer is yes, banks can do it by increasing loans and deposits simultaneously. The government creates it by creating negative equity for itself, which turns up a positive equity for the recipients in the non-government sector of the economy. Now, Minsky, I've learned all this by building Minsky. I didn't even understand double entry bookkeeping when I started building Minsky. I initially allowed it to be single entry. So Minsky has taught me an enormous amount. It is my telescope. It's my Galilean contribution. And you're never going to understand astronomy if you don't have a telescope. And you're never going to understand money if you don't use Minsky, because Minsky is the telescope. It's the monetary telescope. So if you're serious about it, download it from here. I've put the link in the chat as well. I really am serious here. I want everybody if you're willing to come along and hear me talk about money, then you've got to be willing to download Minsky and try it out for yourself. What I'm going to be doing largely today is saying it's actually quite straightforward to use it. So this is a sped up example of what I could do live, just doing it a bit faster. You can see the clock in the corner there. I'm adding what we call a Godley table to the spread to the canvas of Minsky. Bring up the Godley table and I type in loans, deposits, and bank equity as the three types of assets there. I'm not putting initial conditions in, that's deliberate this time around. Net lending puts credit dollars per year into deposits and adds credit dollars per year to loans. That's accountingly balanced. Interest payments go from deposits to bank short-term equity. So that's a negative there and a positive for the banks. And then I have the bank spending in the opposite direction, because otherwise all the money would accumulate in the bank. So they spend on wages and goods and services and so on. So that took about 87 seconds. And that's given you the basics of money creation. If you understand that, you understand how private banks create money. Now, with the one Godley tables, there can be multiple Godley tables, and in any one model, they interact with each other. So once you've defined, for example, I defined loans as an asset of the banking sector here. You can see this wedge here. I don't do this live. I'll do this live later if you like. But loan is an asset of the banking sector. When you bring up the private window, you click on this wedge, it'll list assets that haven't yet been shown as liabilities. Click on loans and it brings all the operations across. And then you can type in interest and spending there and the other ones. Now, the general rule, and this is again something designing Minsky has taught me, to create money, an operation must occur on both the assets and the liabilities extract equity side of the banking sector. If it doesn't occur on both of them, then you're not creating money. So if you look at the operation of credit there, credit increases assets and increases liability, that creates money. But interest payments on private debt and spending by banks are both on the liabilities and equity side, and they redistribute existing money. They don't create new money. So that's the basic story there. And when you to actually make a model work in Minsky, you can just stick with the tables. I know a lot of people freak out about the idea of mathematical modeling. That's, I'm a mathematical economist. That's one of my habits. I like doing it. But if you don't, you can just look at the tables, and that alone will teach you a lot. But when you define something in Minsky, you use flowcharts. So the most obvious one is what are interest payments? Well, it's the outstanding loans multiplied by the interest rate. And you simply type that onto the canvas. I'll show you some of the tricks of that later if people want to get an idea of how to do it. But you can put a multiply key there, multiply the interest rate by loans, and say that's equal to interest payments. And a similar thing for banks. I've got banks doing spending. I use an engineering concept called a time constant here. The reason being that's time constants are used to design things like springs. So if you have springs on a car, you want that spring to react at the sensible speed to hitting a speed hump on the highway. If it doesn't react at all, you get kicked in the ass. If it reacts too much, your car bounces around like crazy. You want it to react at a certain point. So that's a time constant then. I'm saying it's 2. What I'm actually saying is that if banks had no income coming in at all, and simply had a bank account to run down, it'd take them 2 years to run it down to 0. Whereas for workers, you might have 2 weeks, which would be 0.02 there rather than 2. That's the idea of a time constant. So it expresses in years how long it takes for some process to finish. Now, I then define money as the sum of bank deposits plus short-term bank equity, and GDP is the turnover of money. So the stock of money multiplied by the money velocity of money. That's just straight Milton Friedman when you think about it. So that's the definition to go from the monetary system to a model of GDP. Now, having done that, I've got credit, which I've defined as an element in the table. So credit dollars per year added to deposits, which creates money. Credit dollars per year added to loans, which creates debt, both created at the same time. You can simply make it a control variable by setting up a maximum and minimum value for it, and then having a step size, which I've got there of a step size of 1. So I can just press an arrow key and change the amount while I'm doing a simulation. And that helps you understand what the hell's going on in any dynamic process. So here's me doing that with the model. I put the whole model together there, and I'm now running it with no credit. Then I press the up arrow key. So I've now got $1 per year of credit, then 2, then 3. You can see GDP is rising. You can also see bank equity is going positive and non-bank equity is going negative. Then if I have negative credit, so people are paying their loans down rather than back on again, you get a decline in that. But that has endogenously created money. Okay? There's been no need for the banks to have reserves and deposit or anything of that nature. They simply create that by double entry bookkeeping. They put an amount in your bank account, which is credit. They accord that same as the debt that you owe to them. They've created money by that process. And the system can work. It doesn't have to break down. And this is, people get angry at this sort of stuff. Banks shouldn't be able to do that. Well, they do, for God's sake. It's just the system. Get used to it. You might prefer a better one. You better examine and design it. This is the current system, but it works. Now, when you combine this with the rule that I talked about beforehand, that the sum of all financial equity is 0, then you get this outcome that's turning up over here. For the banks to be in positive equity, the non-bank sector must be in negative equity. And that then means, as individuals, we think, oh, my debts exceed my assets. Your loans, you'll notice here, the deposits in the simulation are 38.9, the loans are 43. There's your negative equity. If we're looking at that, our response is likely to be, oh, I owe more than I'm worth. Maybe I should buy an asset. And we get caught up in asset speculation. I think this is actually a large part of where the lunacy about asset speculation comes from. Now, the similar thing applies for government money in terms of it doesn't need any particular barrow to put money into. So this is now we're doing the same thing for the government. There are reserves, bonds owned by banks, deposits, and banks' equity overall. This is the bank's view once more. And I'm so taking as the net government spending, I call this fiat, but I'm sick and tired of calling it a deficit. Okay, it implies you're running out of money. That's fiat money creation there. You then have interest payments on existing bonds. That adds to bank short-term equity. That's why they buy the bonds. That also increases reserves. And then I add in the banks, the Treasury then sells bonds. It's required to sell those bonds. And that means that money taken out of reserves is then used to buy bonds off the Treasury. Therefore increases the monetary value of bonds at the private banks. Then you have central banks buying bonds as well. Well, that reduces the monetary value of bonds held by banks and increases their reserves. And then finally, I've got the banks doing spending as well, so I can make this also a self-contained system. Otherwise, all the money there wouldn't be any circulation of money between the banking sector and the non-banking sector. That took 2 minutes to build that model. So, 1 minute to build a private money system, 2 minutes to build the banks. It's a lot of time out of your day. Okay. Otherwise, it's trivially simple. We should all be doing it. Now, I then put together what's it look from the point of view of the private sector. And this is the point about government negative equity creating positive equity for the for the non-government sector. There's the creation of money. So both fiat and interest create money. The bond operations don't create money. Okay. The role of them is not to create money. That's an essential blind spot of the mainstream. They believe the bonds have to be sold for the government to create money. I myself was wrong about that. Okay, I thought central bank buying was necessary. It's not. Okay, again, lay out the double entry bookkeeping, you can see it extremely clearly. And then when you have government spending in excess of taxation, that creates fiat money, which turns up for the private sector. It also creates reserves, which is over here, and it adds to the equity of the non-bank public. So that's the non-bank public benefiting from fiat money creation. And then the interest on treasury bonds creates fiat money as well over here. It creates reserves as well, and it adds to the equity of the banking sector. So these are the ways in which the government is creating money as net benefit to the rest of us, which is why it's so crazy to see all this worrying by the mainstream about how it's taking money out of the circulation. So where does the money where does the government get the money from? It creates it by going into negative equity. Here's now seeing the same thing from the point of view of the Treasury, where you have the Treasury's Consolidated Revenue Fund, which is their deposit at the central bank. These are the liabilities it has, bonds owned by banks and not bonds owned by the central bank. And this is its negative equity, which is what creates fiat money, and negative equity for interest, which creates fiat money for the banking sector. So it goes to negative equity for itself. That negative equity creates identical positive equity for the non-government sectors. And we simply, if you get used to it, that's just how it works. Again, it's not criminal behavior. It's not money. It's not magic in that sense. It's simply accounting. So bond sales, I've denigrated the role of bond sales here. What do they actually do? Well, you take a look at the central bank, and bonds. First of all, bond purchases by the central bank create assets for the central bank, which then backs the liabilities that it has. I'll talk about that in more detail later. But the main thing that bond sales do here, if bond sales are equal to the sum of fiat plus interest, the Treasury's Consolidated Revenue Fund will not go negative. And that's the law a lot of people get obsessed by. I've got a Canadian, I can't think of his name right now, and I'm not going to bother to advertise it, but somebody's very angry about saying the government must tax before it spend. And I had a similar exchange with somebody on Twitter recently. It doesn't have anything about the bonds purchases are financed by the reserve creation done by the fiat themselves. So you can start from zero, which I do in the next simulation, and show that the Treasury money creation can occur even with zero money actually being in the Treasury's account. So here are the equations I now put in here. I've got bond sales by the Treasury are equal to the sum of fiat money creation plus interest on existing bonds. And then I have the central bank purchases of bonds are equal to whatever the interest payments are at the time. And when you run it, what you find is the negative equity that the government creates for itself creates positive equity for the banks and the non-bank public. So what we have is that if we understand the system, suddenly a huge amount of politics disappears. All the obsessions about government deficits and getting them down to zero, all just goes away. It's all nonsense. And when you take a look at the data properly, you find the thing which the mainstream ignores, which is private debt. That's the thing which causes financial crises. So here is, this is my using a commercial extension I'm building to Minsky called Ravel, which is designed for multidimensional data analysis. So this is private debt as a percentage of GDP, and I've chosen this the data for America right now. You can see the rise in private debt, which you never hear government officials talking about, and notice the change in debt, which is credit, went from plus 15% before the crisis began to -5 during its steps. That's what caused the crisis. And this is a global phenomenon. This is looking again, I'm now doing the same chart as before, but the blue line is the unemployment rate. Now, if you can't see there's a negative correlation between the two, I recommend the optometrist down at Waterloo in Lower Marsh in Waterloo. I'm just getting a new set of glasses from. It's bleedingly obvious. You've got to be deliberately blind not to see that correlation. And therefore, technically speaking, mainstream economists are deliberately blind. They don't want to see this stuff. I've got sick of showing it to them. They do nothing about it. And it isn't just America. This is my software now being used for a number of countries. The United States, the UK, you can see the crash in 2008. There's Thailand, the Asian financial crisis. Spain, the crisis it went through. Portugal, negative credit turning up is the important thing to look for. Malaysia, the Asian financial crisis once more, and here's Japan. Japan should have been the canary in the coal mine for all of us, but instead we ignored it. And because idiots like Bernanke thought they were the experts on this thing, we went through this experience and learned absolutely nothing from it. So the mainstream obsession with government debt has also made the private debt system worse, again, because it encourages us to borrow money to gamble on rising asset prices. And what causes rising asset prices? The fact that we're borrowing money. We get caught in an amplifying feedback loop that leads to financial crises. So here's looking at the global situation now. So I've pooled global data for the Bank of International Settlements on about 43 countries, the major countries in the global economy. And what you can see is that private debt has been rising really since the end of the Second World War. It's almost a linear rise in the ratio over time. Government debt fell until we got governments who got obsessed about the level of government debt, after which it rose. Okay, so everything they did made things worse on their own scale. And what you see is a global increase in levels of aggregate debt. I'm far more worried about this than I'm about that. But because the mainstream worry about that, we get this. So we have an enormous amount of political discussion. I'd say something in the order of 70 to 80% of political discussion is simply, to use a technical term, bullshit. Okay, it's worrying about something that is not a problem. It's a non-problem. We should stop obsessing about government debt, stop obsessing about a balanced budget, which is nonsense. We need fiat money creation in a mixed fiat credit world. But we've let ourselves do this right to the stage where we're on the brink of, in my opinion, catastrophic climate change. And one other thing I'm working on at the moment is the garbage that mainstream economists did on climate, absolutely dreadful stuff which should never have been published. I haven't read a single paper by a mainstream economist that I believe should have been published on climate change. And yet they've set us up to believe climate change is no big deal. So that's a link to my paper. Thankfully, the journal has now made it permanently open access, so you can find that just by clicking on that particular link. And I've got a report which I'm hoping coming out on Friday. It should be out on Friday from Carbon Tracker, pointing out how this has jeopardized our pensions completely. Now, if you look at the nonsense that mainstream economists put about climate change, this is why we've done so little about it. This is a survey in 2021 where these two consultants, as it happens, surveyed over 2,000 economists, which is about 2 to 3% of the population of economists, by the way. It's not large. 2 to 3%, which have published an article on climate change in one of the 25 main neoclassical journals. And they literally argued that 7 degrees of warming would reduce GDP in 2020 by 20%. Now, this is the table. I've put this is pulling together both the questionnaire as they were asked and their answers. So they were given a table showing what happens if global warming is 1.2 degrees by 2025. We're probably already there. 3 degrees by 2075, 5 by 2130, or 7 by 2220. And these predictions here about what GDP would be in the absence of global warming come from William Nordhaus's DICE model. So this is what his model assumes, and it's all made up numbers, by the way, the whole damn thing. He assumes, pardon me, that in 2 centuries hence, GDP will be about 30 or 20 times what it is now, 21 times. The answers they gave, I'm now summarizing them over here, talk about it being 20% smaller. So rather than GDP being 20 times what it is today, it'll be about 18 times. That's what they think is going to happen from global warming. And when you work out what it means in terms of an aggregate rate of growth over time, it means that they believe that global warming leading to a 7-degree increase in global average temperatures in 2 centuries hence will cause the rate of economic growth to decline by 0.02% per year. Now, that's below the level at which we can currently measure actual GDP change. Okay. Now, you ask scientists what's involved, and this is why scientists are wondering why they haven't been listened to. It's because they've been drowned out by the bloody economists. So here's a couple of climate scientists tending to codify what's becoming common wisdom amongst climate scientists. 5 degrees above, you're talking catastrophic existential threats. And what are the politicians being told? 10% fall in GDP in 2 centuries' time. That's one reason we're just not taking it seriously. So we're going to be forced. Reality doesn't care what economists think, which normally I'm happy about. This time around, I'm rather terrified by, because we're going to start seeing catastrophic effects hitting us, I think, in the next decade. certainly in the next 2 decades, we'll be forced into saying everything we possibly can to avoid the destruction of our civilization. And in that situation, I can't see the private financial sector surviving. There's no way you can make a profit in this situation. You won't be selling bonds to help companies get smaller. It's going to be something which is going to be actually involve rationing of consumption. We will not be able to, we can't let Richard Branson eat and the rest of us starve. Okay, Richard might be a nice guy, but that sort of things happens. He'll end up on a pitchfork. Okay, we have serious breakdown in social relations coming our way unless we have a monetary system and a governance system that can hold some semblance of civilization together while we go through the chaos that economists have set us up for. So a proposal I've been working on, nowhere near enough putting into it because I simply haven't got time. There are too many pieces of nonsense in neoclassical economics to fight, and I don't get resources that I need to do this stuff anyway, so I'm always struggling to get anything done properly. But the idea is to bring in a monetary system which has 2 prices to it, both a money price and a carbon price. Money price you pay out of your current wallet. A carbon price you would pay out of a ration, which would be distributed daily or weekly through central bank digital currencies. I've got the D the wrong way there, pardon me. And you could actually allocate this at the national average. You wouldn't need, for Christ's sake, let's not wait for an international agreement. You know, the next COP is taking place, in an Arabic country with the head of an oil group? We're not going to get anything done at the international level by agreement. So this is actually partly the tactics of the fossil fuel companies. The more we talk about international agreements, the less we're going to do. So you could do it at the national level and everybody gets the average. Therefore, 95% would not reach their ceiling. The top 5% would. They'd be forced to buy their credits off the bottom 95%. So it'd be an income distribution from the rich to the poor as well. And you'd set the carbon price by the market rather than a bunch of economists trying to guess what it should be. And it would be a direct transfer from the rich to the poor. I started working on this idea and then I got approached by a guy called Adam Hardy, who'd first of all come up with the idea himself. He again is doing all this stuff for free. He's self-supporting. So please do check out ecocore.org to see what the ideas are. And in terms of my own work, I'm winding up now, obviously. I appreciate followers on Patreon supporting me for what I do, equally on Substack. And I'm now giving a set of online lectures, which started with dreadful marketing, but I've now got control of the marketing to some extent. So it goes through a free book as usual, gets you into a free offer that seems to work on the fear of missing out crowd. I'm now trying to get direct marketing of that so I can teach these ideas and get people to have a more sensible approach to understanding the monetary system and the ecology. And I'll leave it at that. Let's have a conversation.
Fantastic. Can we please show our appreciation to Professor Steve P for that masterclass, not just in terms of where money comes from, but pointing us to the hard facts about where we are in terms of catastrophic climate change. Steve, Professor Keane, that was, as always, so thought-provoking. There are going to be lots of questions and comments. We're going to go to Charlie Ball first. Charlie was itching to come in earlier. Charlie, go for it.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, just one very quick question to Steve. Can you give 2 maybe reasons off the top of your head why literally everyone in the world is so completely clueless about this stuff?
Neoclassical economists. If you look at the long history of economic thought, everything went wrong from Adam Smith on. Okay, I blame Adam Smith for derailing us because before Adam Smith, we had a group called the Physiocrats, and the Physiocrats were based in France and had a rural analysis of economics, but they got a fundamental insight correct, and that was there is no surplus. So what we're doing is we're taking the free gift of nature, as they called it, and then using that to turn energy and matter into forms that are more useful for us, of our industrial society. And they were correct. They said land is the source of all wealth. What they meant actually was energy is the source of all wealth. And in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, which are the only laws you can't break, that is absolutely correct. Smith came along, coming from industrial Scotland. He said, oh, no, it's labour and the specialisation and division of labour, that creates wealth. Well, then you had the whole load of, well, who diverts it? Do the workers get it or the capitalists? The whole value war thing began from that point on. Marx finally terms the classical school as a weapon against capitalism by arguing that the ultimate direction of the development of a capitalist economy will be for the rate of profit to fall and that would rely upon workers being the source of all value, and therefore that'll lead to socialism. And then when Marx turned the classical school from being a defense of capitalism to an attack on it, what was the undergrowth stuff, the garbage stuff that people didn't take seriously, that became the dominant theory of economics. So you'll find a guy called Jean-Baptiste Say, who was actually a friend of Ricardo's, and they corresponded on money creation and a whole range of other issues all the time. But Say was a neoclassical. Everything's about utility maximization, blah, blah, blah. Now, when you put that model together, money can have no effective role, because all that matters is how you allocate your purchases between goods and services you wish to buy, and the money system is supposed to be irrelevant. Effectively, we're working in a barter model. So that's become ingrained into how that mainstream economists think, and they don't go and check the history. They don't go and see that barter never existed as a means of exchange inside a society. They don't go and see how banks operate. And their theories of banking were actually designed so you can ignore banking when you model. So when they say, for example, that banks lend out reserves, that's only possible if all loans are in cash, and I can show that with Minsky pretty rapidly. But it also means the government's responsible for the amount of money. So if anything goes wrong, it's the government's fault. And that was Milton Friedman and Bernanke's explanation for the Great Depression. And then when you say money is part of aggregate demand, then the monetary system matters. You can't ignore it. But they prefer to ignore it, and that's what they teach. And it's just like I have a bunch of astronomers teaching everybody the Earth is the center of the universe, and the moon and stars and planets orbit around us. And then if you say that's not right, you're a heretic.
But can I just ask, I mean, if you take all the economic stuff out of it and every economist's opinion, I mean, the fact that money's created by high street banks, there are numerous YouTube videos on it. People always go in and apparently do their own research, and it's on the Bank of England's own website. I still don't understand why that's so misunderstood in the media, even though, like you say, it's not a crime. It's just how the system works.
It's conventional thought. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm on the rank of Max Planck or Galileo, but I know what it's like to be coming up with a coherent alternative and being ignored by the dominant paradigm, despite the fact the dominant paradigm is riddled through with anomalies that it can't explain. And this is the nature of humanity. It comes back to what are humans? What's special about humans versus any other species? And we tend to focus upon our intelligence, which of course is necessary. But what it lets us do is share beliefs. And we act on those shared beliefs. And then ultimately those shared beliefs define us. I saw a wonderful tweet, I wish I kept a copy of it, and somebody saying, humans would rather die than change their beliefs. And I think that's fundamentally true.
You get a copy of it.
Yeah, and it applies to scientists as well. So Max Planck had discovered quantum mechanics, and the way he did it involves what's called integration in the complex plane, as it happens, to solve what's called the black body radiation problem. He didn't expect to find it. It was a surprise to him that energy came in fixed discrete units he called quanta. He said he did not manage to convince a single one of his Maxwellian fellow physicists, none of them. He said they simply had to wait for them to retire and be replaced. So it's not, economics is special not because economists are particularly thick in that particular way. It's just that we don't get the generational change that occurs in science after anomalies, because in science, the anomaly is permanent. The black body radiation problem, in a couple of hours, a student could make an experiment showing the black body radiation issue.
But do you think that the digital age has also clouded this whole process as well?
No, I think in some way the digital age makes it more obvious, because you see when you get a loan from a bank, it turns up in your deposit account. You can see it straight away. In the old days, you had to get a check and then deposit the check and so on and so forth. I think the digital age makes it easier, but the trouble is it's also led to the obsession with Bitcoin. So, rather than solving it,
even though you get the mortgage immediately in your bank account or whatever, people still think it comes from somebody else's savings.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and this is just a lack of capacity to. Again, mainstream economics doesn't understand dynamics. They have what they called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which is, speaking as somebody with a mathematical training, they're neither dynamic nor general. The stochastic equilibrium models, and that's how they think. And then with that hang up, you can't actually understand anything about a dynamic process. Yet they think they're doing dynamics. So, you know, they're hermetically sealed from reality.
If I may, we'll open up to other comments and questions in a moment. This is just so fascinating, Steve. It really is so fascinating. I'd like to ask you a question about what it's like being Professor Steve Keen. You've kind of already touched on this. What is it like being you, seeing what you see, with others around you either not seeing it or seeing it and ignoring it? What's it actually like, Steve?
It's incredibly frustrating and depressing. And I mean, one of my brothers-in-law is becoming quite a good artist. He wants to do a portrait of me for the Archibald Prize in Australia, which he'll have a crack at. And he said he wants to show me looking cheerful. He said, basically, I'm a cheerful, friendly person. So you spend 50 years with neoclassical economists, you become a curmudgeon because there are such a bunch of ignorant fuckwits who obstruct knowledge. And I just find it incredibly frustrating. And for light relief, to some extent, I'm reading Galileo's correspondence these days. Yeah. And there's one beautiful line where Galileo writes to Kepler and says, "My dear Kepler, what are we to say of these learned gentlemen at the local university who, with the perspicacity of an asp, refused to look down the telescope?" Yeah. And that's, you know, and like the neoclassicals, my favorite example there is Alan Blinder, as it happens, who was a vice president of the Federal Reserve and a vice president of the American Economic Association as well, who did a survey of firms in terms of their manufacturing costs and found stuff which contradicted mainstream theory, literally wrote in his book, this is overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory, and then failed to convert that, failed to put in his own textbook. Okay. So they find stuff which contradicts their beliefs, and rather than abandoning their beliefs, they contradict their research. Marx was the same. So like, I find it incredibly frustrating, Andy, and I don't know, you know, I've just got to basically laugh at it and just keep on fighting as best I can. And the thing is, I also think we're going to see us destroying human civilization courtesy of these beliefs. I really think if we're lucky, we've got 2 decades, and it'll be the fault of economists fundamentally that leads to the destruction of capitalism. And that shows you how little they know about real capitalism.
This is serious stuff, Professor Keen. We are so grateful to you. So folks, we're going to open it up now. The session's scheduled to finish at roughly 7:30 UK time. We've got about half an hour or so to share our thoughts and comments and insights and experiences. As I mentioned earlier, please do so, you know, candidly. This is an environment where you are safe to share what you really think, and don't be scared to be progressive and even radical. You're amongst friends. So please raise your hand either digitally or otherwise to come in. I can see Steve Hubbard is dying to do that. Steve, please put your point. Let's all be as succinct as we can, please, folks. We can get as many chances for interactions as possible. Steve Hubbard, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an apostle, really, I suppose, of Steve Keen. I've known him a long time and I count him as a friend. But I've also talked around, and I think Charlie Boyle has made some very, very strong points as well. I would agree with him. But it is of interest to me as to why people are resistant to even the idea, the simple idea of the starting of the banks creating money out of nothing. I mean, people are resistant to that, even from square one. And I was to start with as well. And unlike Charlie, perhaps I come from completely outside the field. I've got a physics background, so technology is more my thing than economics. So it's not that I've come from that, but it took me several years to agree with Steve Keen almost. It took me a number of years to actually get my head around the fact that there was an alternative reality. And I just don't think that other people put the time in or the effort in. They have a superficial view. They tend to believe what they're told, and that's an end of it. And if you disagree, then that end of it is your mistake, not theirs, and they just walk away. That's been my experience. But the point I'm making really, I suppose, is the time that it's taken me to absorb the realities of what Steve Keen, etc., have been saying. That's all.
Thank you, Steve. Cheers. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to go to Richard Emery. Richard, could you please bring the question you put into chat into life, and please don't hesitate to explain why that particular question is of interest to you. So Richard, go for it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a piece of text which I've been typing into the chat so everybody can see it.
Right, okay.
So you can read this once I've talked. Right. My question, and I value the opinion of people like Steve and Charlie and others, relates to something which is very much more today than the big picture. I appreciate all you're saying about the big picture, but the question is this: do high interest rates reduce inflation? So I'll just read very quickly, I put it into the chat. Who is impacted by increased interest rates? Individuals borrow money on their credit cards and their interest rate is not linked to base rate. Small and medium-sized businesses are run on overdrafts and loans, so increased interest rates result in increased costs, thus increased prices, creating inflation. People who hold mortgages are impacted by increases in interest rates, resulting in less spending capacity, which might reduce inflation. But people who have savings should be getting higher interest on their savings, thus increasing spending, balancing the reduction in the spending by mortgage holders. But banks increase mortgage rates by greater margins than the increases in savings rates, resulting in increased profits for the banks. Is this Andrew Bailey's real objective?
Thanks, Richard. We're going to Steve, Professor Keith first, and then Charlie wants to come in on this one as well. Steve, your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, it's a mixed issue for a whole range of reasons, because first of all, there are two key interest rates that matter. There's a whole spectrum of interest rates, but the interest on government debt and interest on private debt are your two different brackets. Now, when the government puts up interest rates, that doesn't actually affect the cost of banks at all. They get affected by the borrowing rate, which that's a sort of hypothetical flaw, but it doesn't affect their source of money because they create the money. So it's not increasing their costs in that sense, but they will put their rates up when the government puts its rates up. Now, the government, because the government's required to issue bonds and required to sell them to the banking sector first off, then the banking sector gets a whole lot of bonds of different maturities, 30-year down to 1 year, with fixed coupon rates in most of the cases. Now, the longer the term of the bank bond, the more a change in current interest rates affects the value of the coupon rate. So if you go for the ultimate situation of a consul, which is the easiest way to model this, and imagine that all bonds are consuls, then if you double the interest rate, you halve the value of bonds. That's what's been that's what caused the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, because they had lots of long-dated bonds. The government put up the interest rate on new bonds. That meant anybody who bought new bonds gets a higher rate of interest. So that's a positive income return for them. But anybody holding those as an asset, which is marked to market, the value collapsed. So it's a very complex issue. So I think at the initial stage, the impact of the increasing interest rate effectively reduce the asset value of both banks and non-bank financial institutions, Goldman Sachs and that sort of thing, in the financial world, and could have actually broken the financial system, because you went from interest rates of 0.5% and less to 5%, which is a gigantic change in the interest rate flow, and therefore a gigantic change in the value of the coupon rates being paid by those bonds. So anybody with long-dated bonds is in deep shit, courtesy of that increased interest rates. But then if you look at new rate bonds coming out, because the American government is running a deficit now of roughly 10% of GDP, and it's paying 5% interest on those bonds, the new bonds coming out are a major source of income for those who buy the bonds, which wasn't the case 2 years ago because the bonds paid such a trivial rate of interest. So you have all these factors coming together. I think overall that increasing the rates will lead to negative credit at some point by the private sector, and the negative credit will counteract the impact of a deficit or fiat money creation and cause a downturn. It looks like that's worse in Europe than it is in America, because America's, even though all the nonsense about the debt ceiling affected their policy just recently, they're still running a deficit of about 8 to 10% of GDP, which is quite high on historical averages, whereas the UK and most of Europe, courtesy of the Maastricht Treaty, is going into declining government money creation. So you're getting a negative for money, government money creation, and a negative from falling bond values all at once in Europe. So I think Europe's going to suffer a decline in aggregate demand. America, given all those factors, might still be coming out ahead.
Wow, remarkable.
Incredible.
Remarkable. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Steve. Charlie Ball, you wanted to come in on Richard's question.
Yeah, just very quickly, I've got no numbers to back this up, but one of the reasons why I blew the whistle on Barclays was just to prove that the culture hadn't really changed. And one of the things I said at the time was that there are a number of unintended consequences of having free banking in the UK. And it means that high street banks a lot of the time have to rip people off in other ways. For example, charging you £35 just for going, 10p overdrawn, or not giving you the interest rate sort of in line with the market. It's I just saw it from a cultural perspective, really. So you shouldn't automatically assume that when interest rates go up, you get more money for your current account, because a lot of banks will be incurring losses on the back of people that have got incentives to move banks and are slightly in credit, but not much for years on end, and don't really earn any money from a lot of their customers, and then make it up in other ways.
Yeah, I want to show this little impact here, by the way. This is data from the Bank of England showing the Bank of International Settlements. And you can see that private debt between 1957 and 1977 never hit 70% of GDP. Now, the Bank of England has data going back to 1880. And I may imagine they go further back still. So there was no change in the level of private debt to GDP for a century until Maggie Thatcher deregulated the housing market and let banks lend to housing. And then you went from 60% to more than 180% in a matter of 2 decades. So, there's ways in which the banking sector has been liberated to prey on the rest of us, courtesy of neoliberal banking concepts.
And as you may well know, in the UK, the direction of regulation is to deregulate. The Financial Conduct Authority is being tasked with a competitiveness agenda to make the system more competitive. So we effectively have a regulator who's becoming a cheerleader for the City of London. That surely must be conflicted. Let's go to...
Yeah,
Go on, Richard. Sorry. Go on, Steve.
I'm just saying this is the opposite of what we should be doing, because when deregulating it, we're saying, oh, banks, you're these wonderful creatures who can create money. How magnificent and brilliant of you. You should do it because you know what you're doing. They're just banks because they're allowed to be banks. Yeah, there's no special skill involved in creating money. It's putting stuff on assets and liabilities at the same time. So they deserve to be regulated because their power to create money is an enormous power. It's socially conferred and it should be socially controlled.
Understood. Thank you. Who'd like to come in with a comment or a question at this point? Please raise your hand, either digitally or, of course, old school, literally. If not, I'll ask a few myself. I think I will. Professor Keane, you've given us, frankly, a very stark warning that the momentum around incorrect neoclassic economism is going to take us to global catastrophic climate change, and you're pretty damn serious about that. What would it take for that not to happen, please? You're on mute, Steve.
It's too late. It's going to happen. The question is how severe it is when it does happen. If we'd followed the limits to growth 50 years ago and taken their advice, we could have tapered to a sustainable society in the future with about half the population we have now, because one of the recommendations was population control, a lower level of energy consumption, more energy coming out of renewable. We could have done it over 50 years. Instead, because of neoclassical economists, and specifically William Nordhaus, who played a huge role in rubbishing and denigrating their work, we didn't take their warning seriously. And having kicked them out of the nest like a cuckoo, he produced his own nonsense. And that's what's determined how people think about climate change. And that's why we're in such a disastrous situation. So I can't see us avoiding a crisis. It's a question of whether we hold together as a society on the other side of it. And I don't think we will, frankly.
That's probably the most intense and stark statement I may have ever heard in my whole life. If that ain't thought-provoking, folks, I don't know what is. I really don't know what is. We're going to go to Killian next. Killian, please take a moment to introduce yourself. You're new to TTF, I'm pretty sure. Please take yourself off mute and then share your thought. Thank you, Killian.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my name is Killian O'Brien. I'm a regenerative design specialist, thinker, designer, etc. I've spent the last 15 years thinking about and trying to create action on regenerative systems, move us towards regenerative systems, created a model for that back in 2011 or so. And I just wanted to pipe in to say what Steve just said is basically correct, but also not completely necessarily our fate, in that there are ways to reverse this situation rapidly. It's just not through any of the current systems. You can't do it through technology because it all takes too long. If you follow the work of people like Simon Michaud and other people, you'll know. And there's a conversation with Steve and I and Simon Michaud on my Clubhouse house that we did a couple months ago. So we don't have the resources for all these multiple 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 global systems to build out, especially if we're going to do it equitably. But what we can do is do the obvious thing, and that is to do the low-hanging fruit, which is to simplify rapidly. What Steve, I think, means really is the political will and the awareness and the knowledge isn't there to make any of that happen, is probably what he really means. And in that regard, I think he's right. The chance that we succeed is this small. However, the mechanisms to do so, I believe, do exist, and the possibility do exist. So if we go to nature-based solutions, great. And the thing that everyone ignores is when you have an extremely overly complex system, the only way to correct that is to go to simplicity. And you can look back through all of history. There's no other way to do it. And you can look at the diminishing returns on complexity curve, right? All these things. It's really, really obvious. It's simple and obvious. You don't need to have a PhD. I don't have a PhD. I don't even have a master's. But this stuff is really easy to understand if you have a few little pieces of information at hand. So we can reverse things very quite quickly. We can get back to 300 and less ppm in anywhere from 20 to 50, 60, 70 years, if we're taking the right approaches. But that means simplification. Now that takes care of 80% of the emissions right there. Boom, done. 80% of emissions just by choosing to live simply instead of complexly. That's it. You get another 40%, yeah, just half second. Another 40% from agricultural practices. And that's outside of anything else we would do. So we can do this. It's a matter of will and awareness and choosing to do it. Thanks.
Killian, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to meet you tonight. The first time you've come to a TTF event, you've clearly put a great deal of thought into these issues. You're making me think of Cat Stevens, you know, the singer from the 60s and 70s. The reason being, he performed at Glastonbury over the weekend. I watched it on TV last night with my wife. And one of the statements he made was that all the world leaders should be sent to London Zoo and locked up. My point being that maybe what's necessary is a complete replacement of the leadership of the world, because the current leadership of the world is kind of what got us where we are. That's a pretty facetious comment, but I think somewhere within that is a truth. We're going to go to our next new attendee. Edward Bannister, please take a moment to introduce yourself and share your thought, please, Edward.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'd also like to thank Steve for his excellent explanation and his Minsky software, which I have spent many hours trying to learn and use. He shows it off with great acumen, something I've yet to attain, but I'm working on it. I would also like to thank Charlie and possibly answer Charlie's question, which is, by the way, I subscribe to everything that both Charlie has said and Steve Professor Steve has pointed out with regard to the creation of money. And I think part of the reason that this is not promoted is very simplistic. The existing authorities benefit greatly from the complete lack of understanding that the mainstream have, and much of their advantage would be dissipated and severely undermined were this to become widely and fully appreciated. And therefore, for the longest period of time, and they continue to ensure and take steps that it isn't, not the least of which is also because the creation of money allows for the destruction of money and the abuse of money. And they take full advantage of those aspects as well. And we see that most clearly pointed out in things like why the mortgage prisoners have not been sorted out, and indeed in the GRG scandal and all the other elements that the TTF are exploring and looking into. And those events would not be possible and would not be maintained if indeed the full appreciation of what Charlie and Steve have been talking about this evening was widely understood. And that's why I think to the great extent a lot is actively done to maintain ignorance, etc. So that's my modest little contribution.
I'm actually going to disagree with you, if I can quickly, and that's because these guys say the stuff for free. Okay? It's not the case that neoclassicals are paid shrills for capitalism. They're people who say stuff that benefits powers that be by saying, "Don't worry about the finance sector. That just allocates resources efficiently. No, don't." And so, in that sense, they benefit from it, and they'll pump out things like the Modigliani-Miller hypothesis and other pieces of nonsense like that by neoclassical economists, because it makes them look, important and central and so on. But it's not a case that there's economists are saying this because they're being paid to. They're saying it because they believe it, and then it benefits the powers that be, who then amplify their message.
Right. Then in that case, perhaps I expressed myself poorly, because I certainly agree with what you've just said. But yeah, let me leave it there.
It's remarkable. It's such a remarkable dynamic. Thank you. Charlie put his hand back up. Charlie, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's one economist that, or someone with a finance background that I have a great amount of respect for, that still believes in the old method of money creation. And I just find it baffling that all you have to do is go on the Bank of England's website and you'll just find that, 2 sentences, like half a paragraph. Another thing to bear in mind is I've been going around various pubs around the world telling people about this stuff. Most people find this entire subject incredibly mind-numbingly boring.
Yeah.
That could be part of it as well. Just putting it out.
I think that's that's very important. And I think the thing is, humans were not designed for systemic thinking. We were designed to have parties and invade the African savannah and take over. Yeah.
When I was in my early 20s, I didn't give a stuff about any of this stuff until it started affecting me personally.
Yeah, it's only after you get shot in the foot that you wonder how rifles work. I mean, it's so that it is a classic case. The systemic thinking, which is what virtually everybody here is into, is not something that's a commonplace attitude for most people. They'd rather be out there partying and wondering what Britney Spears is going to wear in a next concert. So we're paying for the triviality of our species, which is partly why we've been so successful. But now it's becoming, we can no longer afford to be unable to think in a systemic fashion. It's absolutely vital that we do it from now on. And we should have been doing it 50 years ago.
Professor Keane, are there any countries that are giving you reason for hope? Are there any countries that seem to operate differently to the rest of the pack with their policies? Any thoughts on that?
No, not really. I mean, you get some national variations. The New Zealand political system tends to be more progressive than most parts of the world, partly because of the way that they were defeated by the Maoris, the English, when the only country they ever had to sign a treaty with the country they were invading was New Zealand. And that's giving you a form of politics which is more representational and more community oriented. So New Zealand tends to do a bit better. Other countries like Uruguay is a similar sort of politically progressive part of the world. I look at countries and think which countries are more likely to survive what we're going to go through. And it tends to be countries where there's some acceptance of top-down control to some extent and some respect for the military. Because if you're going to ration in the sort of situation I think we're into, you've got to have a military that actually knows what it's doing and is respected. And that doesn't apply to any Western military that I've seen so far. So I don't see it coming to the countries. Well, I see it coming down to countries in that sense, yeah, but not countries that are doing the right thing or understand stuff now. Just countries are more likely to be able to cope with the disturbance we're going to get and have some way of hanging on to their society in the downturn.
This is serious stuff. One more quick question from myself, if I may, then we'll go to anybody else that hasn't yet had a chance to come in. What would be the one thing that if you could only have one wish come true, Professor Keane, what would be the one thing that you'd go for? You might be on mute, Steve.
Economists turning into porpoises and sending a message saying so long and thanks for all the fish and going to another planet.
Right. Exactly.
That'd be the best thing. If you could get rid of the lot and replace them with engineers and biologists, and we can start doing something else. So that eliminating economics would be the best thing, but it's not going to happen. So it's and like in terms of practical thing, I'd like to have central bank digital currencies invented before the crisis hits, because there's been a slightly more realistic wish. With central bank digital currencies, we'd have a distribution system for rationing when necessary. So my first thing and a more practical wish would be central banks bringing in digital currencies, and that's then an avenue for the distribution systems we'll need when we go into serious economic downturn.
Oh, goodness me. We're going to go to Killian. Killian, back to you, sir. If you take yourself off mute, please. There you go.
Thank you for that. I wanted something that was said in the chat about to fix this, we have to stop, right? And we do. And a long time ago, I came across the concept of Jubilee, which I'd never heard of. And this was like 15 years ago, maybe, on the oil drum. And I think Steve has talked quite a bit. Oh, I know Steve has talked quite a bit about Jubilee also. That is a mechanism that could jumpstart some of this change. Just briefly, that is one way to do that if you could get people to do it. And Jubilee is just debt forgiveness. That's all it is, in a nutshell. And then the other thing I wanted to quickly say is about what you, actually I lost my thought. We were just talking about, anyway, I'll close off.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. We ran an event with Steve, which was all about the idea of the debt jubilee. It's really fascinating stuff. For those of you that didn't attend it, we'll see if we can find the recording and circulate it when we circulate the notes and the slides from today's event. Edward, did you put your hand up again? I think you did. Yes.
Please, yes, if I might. I've got a follow-on question just on a practical level. As we go into this downturn that I think we're likely to see, and I agree is unavoidable for any number of reasons, not least of which is because it seems like everybody's decided to, in the banking sector, to try and shrink their balance sheets and get themselves better into alignment. Presumably, since we all agree that banks create money, that will create a short-term lack of liquidity, which will have a devastating further impact on the whole scenario. Am I correct in thinking that? From an economic point of view, in other words, it'll create a self-fulfilling spiral. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, one part of the document I've written for Carbon Tracker talks about a Minsky moment. A Minsky moment being named in honor of Hyman Minsky, obviously the same person I named my software after. And the idea being a sudden realization by the finance sector that we've got things completely wrong, and you then drastically revalue all financial assets. And that could be through destruction of physical capital. It can be through realizing you've got to shut down oil and gas, et cetera, and government policy as well. So all the financial system we've got will just be destroyed by this. And then in that situation, the only form of money creation you're going to have that works is government money creation. So I see this as being the death knell of private money creation as well.
Interesting. I think it's much closer at hand than perhaps we all imagine.
Wow.
Yeah, and can I just on the back?
I think it'll.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Listen, I think it'll die before I do.
I think
Charlie.
what we're going to do, we're going to go to Charlie for his comment and Charlie's final thoughts. Then we're going to go to Professor Steve Keen for his final thoughts, and then we're going to be bringing the session to a close. And with your final thoughts, Steve, there's nothing to rush about, so feel free to take the conversation wherever you'd like to leave it. Okay, Charlie, to you first for your comment and your final thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, on the back of the last question, I've been very frustrated the last sort of 6 or 9 months. We've got this obsession with talking about recession, which is just a technical term. And what I've been saying to people is, if you look through the last couple of financial crises, it's all been based around what happens with credit and credit contraction. Certainly happened in 2008. So what worries me is not what's happening now or a technical recession. And there's an argument to say that inflation actually helps to keep us out of recession, because everything is, if things are more expensive, it's inflating GDP. But it's what happens in 6, 9, 12 months' time when we see the impact of these massive interest rate hikes, and what happens with the banks and how they tighten credit. And that can cause a massive recession on the back of it. We won't know, because it's obviously reported in quarters. We won't know until later. So it's the credit that I'm keeping an eye on for this.
Charlie, thank you for those thoughts, and also thank you for stimulating this whole session we have tonight. It's down to you that we're having tonight's meeting. We'll go from Charlie to Professor Steve Keen for his final thoughts, and you have time, Steve, so back to you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to second Charlie's comments there. I think we are going to see a recession caused by a collapse in credit. If they keep the rates as high as they are. Britain's an unusual situation, though, because Britain's inflation rate is still running close to 10%. And a lot of that's got to do with imported inflation and the fact that you're not food self-sufficient. So whereas America's down to 4% now, and most of the rest of Europe as well. So there's no guarantee those rates are going to stay as high as they are. But I think what is guaranteed is we're going to see continuing inflation, because a major source of inflation is the cost of production. And if we start seeing declining energy availability, more expensive energy, and less mineral quality for minerals get reworked by energy, the whole thing, plus also more supply chain disruptions like another version of COVID, which I think we're also fairly likely to see in the next 15 years. And then if you also have globalization being unwound and relocating production back to the first world, which I think is in its own way necessary, all those factors are going to mean the cost of production rises, and that'll come through in costs. But the thing is, you can't, if you have that happen right now, and it is just the working class and the middle class, there's going to be even more income inequality than we have right now, and even more precarious living. So it's quite a scary future we face. I don't have any cheerful thoughts about where we go in the future. In terms of what I'm doing, I mean, I've been lucky to continue being supported by crowdfunding since I ceased being in the university sector. But I know, I need more support. I need more people doing this sort of work. There's never going to be enough for the non-orthodox people out of the academic system. So I'm trying to build a software package called Ravel that I'm going to try to market and make the money that lets me hire the people I want to work with to build the alternative paradigm. But we won't get rid of this stuff until we get rid of the neoclassical paradigm. That's absolutely critical. You can criticize the theory, but if you don't have an alternative, you'll never dislodge it. So there was, 1.5 millennia of people criticizing Ptolemy's model, but 1.5 millennia of it ruling until we had Kepler and Copernicus come along with an alternative model that explained the observations. And that's what I'm trying to build. And the course I'm linking to that free book thing there, the free lecture course, is trying to build as many people having the awareness as how the economy operates as possible, and spread my Minsky software around as widely as I can, because until we start using a telescope, we never understood the heavens. And the same thing applies here. Until we understand the monetary system and understand dynamics properly, we'll never understand capitalism. And that includes when we're actually driving it extinct. So, come along and support me on those pages. Help build an alternative paradigm, because otherwise we are stuffed anyway. We're even more stuffed without an alternative.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm just going to share my screen here to draw your attention, everyone, to the page that has just been referred to. So this is Professor Steve Keen's Patreon page. I'm going to put a link to this in the chat. We'll also circulate it afterwards. I'm about to do what I do from now every now and then, which is just to speak straight from the heart. And what's inspired me to say what I'm about to say is something that Anne-Marie Borg put in the chat. Anne-Marie Borg put this. She says, if this catastrophic situation is close, what are the best strategies to cope and to face it? How do we prepare our children? And the reason I'm talking about our children is because even if it's too late for us, maybe we can make the life of our children, those who are blessed to have them, and our children's children better. The harsh reality is that all the data is pointing to catastrophic climate change and complete meltdown of the financial system. Those are really uncomfortable thoughts. It takes mental effort to take yourself to that kind of dark, dismal place. It's damn scary. But if we don't have the compulsion to act for our own sake, maybe the thought about the generations that might follow us or might not follow us is going to make the difference. And if all of this leaves you thinking, well, what can I actually do? Use your vote. For goodness sake, folks, regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of how you voted in the past, why don't we become extremely demanding of our elected representatives? Why don't we vote in accordance with our belief, if you have this belief, that we are on the slippery slope to a ruinous state in the not too distant future? So please use your vote. Do all you can to vocally support and be seen to be supporting people like Professor Steve Keen, because this is the kind of thing that can potentially make a difference. There's that wonderful quotation from the anthropologist, all about the idea that, you know, even a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has. There's always hope until we give up. There's no point giving up. There's no point giving up. And however bleak it is, let's go down fighting. And the manifestation of fighting right now is backing people who have the intelligence and the courage and the foresight and the determination to speak out and keep on speaking out and keep on speaking out. People like Professor Steve Keen. We're going to wrap it up there, folks. And I please invite you to do all you can in your little bit, in your little way, to help make a difference. Professor Steve Keen, Charlie Borg, thank you very much indeed for such a thought-provoking set of thoughts today. Thank you. We'll wrap it up there, folks. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Good night all. Good night all. And think about what we've learned. And let's do something about what we've learned. Thank you.